Lanny, do you agree with that? I mean, our principle number two that we have to get to here is the budget crisis. But Neil is saying that basically, you know, they're going to try and maybe sweep that under the rug, since they can say today, look at this, we were running a surplus. I mean, we raised taxes on 77% of the population, and as a result, we don't have a budget problem anymore.
Well, first of all, I remember David Stockman, something of a hero of mine, when he was taken to the woodshed for trying to tell the truth to Ronald Reagan, and I believe. Or was it President Bush 1, David? I forget when you were in the woodshed.
Reagan.
But in any case...
I think it was Fillmore.
And to be on a panel following Neil is very difficult, tough act to follow. I've called with Governor Tom Ridge in last week's USA Today, and through all my writings in my weekly column, that Messrs. Simpson and Bowles are the only ones who got bipartisan support for facing reality, and which David Stockman has pointed out. Our generation, mine and maybe before me, has done the immoral act of taking credit cards, running up debt, and turning it over to our children and our grandchildren to pay the bills. I hope President Obama steps up to the line tonight and says, no more credit cards. If I'm going to spend $1, it's going to be taken away from another program, and I'm going to raise taxes, including on the middle class, because we're not going to raise enough money from the upper class, and go back to the Clinton tax rate era where we did so well and start paying down this immoral debt.
David, do you have any hope of any of that happening?
Well, I think it needs to be talked about, and I was delighted to hear Lonnie say that. Because it is so obvious to people who aren't caught up in the Beltway that the credit card is tapped out. We can't continue to spend $100 billion every month or borrow. By the way, the Treasury borrowed $137 billion in the last 2 months, even though there was supposedly a short-term deficit surplus. That was simply due to one-time dividend payments and capital gains at the end of the year. So that isn't meaningful. We can't have the Fed continuing to borrow or to print $85 billion a month, which they're doing. This is a huge Ponzi scheme, and I agree. We need to have a tax increase on everybody, the wealthy and the middle class. We need to reform entitlements and put a means test on the better off Social Security, which means they wouldn't like it in Florida. But you're not going to hear that from Rubio tonight. We need to dramatically cut back the defense budget and allow this sequester to happen. They're all running around like it's the end of the world, when in fact we would still have a defense budget 60% higher than Bill Clinton's last budget, and that was big enough as far as I'm concerned.
And Neil, this says nothing of our place in the world. I mean, number 3 on our money list for the State of the Union was our place around the world as we try to influence what's going on in the Middle East as that explodes. You look at North Korea and what is going on there, and you wonder, do we hold any clout in the rest of the world any longer, or is it diminishing what clout we had?
I always say that much of the prestige that we have owes nothing to us doing anything great, but that the rest of the world looks so sucky by comparison. I don't mean to sound irreverent here, but it's easy to be the tallest pygmy in the room and think you're still not a pygmy when you are. And I think by comparison to Europe and all of its problems, we look very fiscally prudent these days, I guess, but that doesn't mean we are. And I think the harsh and cruel reality is that if we turn our back on this golden moment, both Democrats and Republicans have so early in a new year to address these problems, next year at this time we'll be knee-deep in midterm election planning and worrying and already crafting the 2016 election map strategy, and we'll be trillions more in debt. Now, I know there are a lot of fancy terms to use this debt that isn't so bad, that as a percentage of GDP, it's actually okay. Revenues as a percentage of GDP could actually go higher. There are all sorts of fancy ways you could justify just leaving well enough alone. But we really can't leave well enough alone. It's sort of like if you get a new job and you have a little bit more money, you think, well, those Visa and MasterCards I have jacked up to the limit, they're not so bad. Well, they're still jacked up to the limit, aren't they? And that's the reality Republicans and Democrats both have to face. I don't agree with David that the solution is just to hike taxes a lot on everybody. I know where he's coming from. I think there's a good deal of spending that we got, including defense and all of this. I'd like to at least venture that before we start going on a tax hike campaign. But I will say this, that I don't see the appetite or the direction. To Lanny's point, and to his credit of the Clinton years, all they had to do back in the Clinton years, and I say all, but they did it, and my hat's off to them, is show a direction that these deficits would get better, that this was a serious blueprint for getting this down to size. You don't have to wipe out the 16 trillion today.
Okay.
You just have to provide the roadmap. They do that. They could be on the way.
Big Cheese, I got to interrupt you. Before we run out of time, we've got to do the money meter. On a scale of 1 to money, I want to ask you about Marco Rubio, because very high expectations for his response tonight. And I'm worried it's a lot of pressure. I mean, there's a lot of focus there. On a scale of 1 to money, David Stockman, let me start with you. How do you think he's going to perform?
I'm putting a 2 on it. I think
2? That's a low ball.
I think he'll give a very handsome speech, but it'll have no content. It'll be more warmongering from the neocon point of view.
Okay.
And I don't think he's addressing the real issue, which is how to cut the deficit and Social Security.
Okay. Lenny Davis, what do you think? Scale 1 to money.
I think whatever the highest number is, money, that Marco Rubio will outperform expectations because, David, television is not content, it's a visual media, and he will be very visual.
Okay. All right. And Big Cheese, Neil Cavuto, I'll let you go last because your vote's the most important, obviously.
I wish that were true, but I would agree with Lenny on this. I'm going to give him a 4 in that I think he will measure up. I think he was sort of like the secret superstar of the Republican convention, gave the best speech. He's very good, articulate, and reasoned in his approach to almost any issue facing the country, and certainly vexing Republicans. I think he will deliver with some sound solutions that might surprise you.
David Stockman, Lenny Davis, Neil Cavuto, thank you all for making this the best power panel of all time, obviously.
Ever.